I'm Lieutenant Governor Jay Darden. Louisiana's natural beauty, rich history, and diverse culture are what make it unique among the 50 states. The Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism is proud to partner with the Louisiana Bicentennial Commission and Louisiana Public Broadcasting to bring you this one-hour tribute to a place that was different in 1812 and remains different and therefore special today.
Major funding for Louisiana, 200 Years of Statehood, is provided by the Louisiana Bicentennial Commission and the Louisiana Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, and by Entergy Louisiana, dedicated to the communities we serve for over 100 years. Entergy, the power of people. The REILLY Family Foundation, supporting the arts, cultural, and health-based initiatives throughout Louisiana since 2002. Your local Louisiana propane dealer, fuel for residential, agricultural, industrial, and commercial uses. Additional funding by ExxonMobil Baton Rouge. And the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
200 years ago, Louisiana was joined to the United States of America, forever changing both. The story of this state is one of adventure and adversity, of controversy and change, of richness and resources, and colorful people in a place unlike any other. Louisiana's story begins with the Mississippi, the great river that formed so much of the land and shaped our history. As a gateway to much of the North American continent, the mouth of the Mississippi River was a strategic prize coveted by European empires.
Whoever controlled the mouth could control the destinies of a continent, and one of the richest, most opulent continents in the history of the world, the Mississippi River Valley.
Ultimately, the French prevailed and envisioned a great capital city for their colony near the mouth of the Mississippi. They named it New Orleans. In 1803, the new American nation came into possession of this critical piece of geography when it purchased the Louisiana Territory from France.
Well, one of the great things about Thomas Jefferson as president is he thought the Mississippi River was not the end of America, that it was actually the spine of the nation, and that we had all this land to the west. Hence, New Orleans became the port city that mattered the most in America by the 1820s.
Not all of present-day Louisiana was included in the purchase. Baton Rouge and the region north of Lake Pontchartrain, east of the Mississippi River, was actually part of western Florida, a territory ruled by the King of Spain. But a number of Anglo-Americans had settled there, and in 1810, they staged a small revolution. The region we call today the Florida parishes broke away from Spanish rule and was eventually annexed by the United States to become part of Louisiana. Most of the vast territory was unsettled, except for the native tribes living there. But the lower portion of the Louisiana Territory, near the river, was populated by the descendants of French colonists. The city of New Orleans was exotic even in its early days. There, in November of 1811, at Tremolet's Coffee House at No. 9 North Levee Street, territorial leaders met to draft a constitution that would make Lower Louisiana an American state. Most of them were native Creoles, and their constitution was, naturally, in French.
When the Americans took over, they didn't know what quite to make of this place. And I think the Creoles were more ready for American democracy than American Democrats were ready to absorb and assimilate people of a different cultural background, different religion, and who were not, they thought, ready for democratic self-government.
On April 30th, 1812, Louisiana became an American state. The same year that Louisiana entered the Union, the United States went to war with Great Britain. English troops had invaded much of the country. They even managed to sack and burn the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. For the British, however, the real strategic prize was the city of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. General Andrew Jackson was dispatched to New Orleans with a small army, hardly adequate to defend the city against the massive invasion he anticipated. But Jackson was no ordinary general.
They were so outmatched. Now, not just in numbers, but in military experience. It seemed like it would be a British slam dunk.
Jackson's troops comprised perhaps the most unusual assembly an American army had yet seen. Along with his white Kentucky riflemen, they included free men of color, wealthy Creoles, and poor backwoods Acadians, as well as Indians from the Choctaw Nation. It was truly a reflection of Louisiana's highly diverse population, but most surprising was the large band of pirates and outlaws that joined their ranks, led by the colorful smuggler, Jean Lafitte. The future of the American nation depended on this ragtag army and their bold general. In a stunning upset, General Jackson managed to rout the enemy and win a lopsided victory. British casualties were staggering, more than 2,000 killed, wounded, or captured in 25 minutes. Jackson tallied the number of his casualties at fewer than 20.
I don't think there was a more important battle in the War of 1812 than the Battle of New Orleans for this reason. It brought America together by holding on to New Orleans and by thwarting the British on the plain of Chalmette. The United States now had full control of the Mississippi River.
Imagine if the British had won and they took this port. They would have free entry into the rest of what would become the United States. There would not have been westward expansion.
Well, it finally validated the War for Independence, that this was a republic, a young republic that was able to defend its interests, defend its border, and make a go of it.
But Louisiana had proven something too. The state was firmly cemented to the Union, and her people had demonstrated that they were now truly loyal Americans. Less than 2 generations later, Louisiana would again become the scene of battle, this time in America's most terrible conflict, the Civil War. Once more, the Mississippi River would play a decisive part.
The Mississippi River was a national highway before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War. The control of it was absolutely important. It was vital to both sides. It was more than simply a trophy for one side or the other. It was the means of victory.
In April of 1862, 46 federal warships steamed up the Mississippi River toward New Orleans under the command of Flag Officer David Farragut. It was the largest fleet the United States Navy had ever assembled. Defending the city were 2 aging forts near the mouth of the river. What followed was an artillery duel of fantastic proportions. Day and night, for nearly a week, the guns thundered, raining down shells on both the forts and the fleet alike. When it was over, New Orleans fell to the Union. But that was hardly the last battle for control of the Mississippi. Upriver, not far from Baton Rouge, Federal troops mounted the longest siege in American history against Confederate fortifications on the river at Port Hudson.
Port Hudson was the first major battle where you had blacks involved in the Civil War. And maybe a 1/4 to a 1/3 of the combatants on the side of the Union were black troops. That made national news. That changed minds. With the fall of Port Hudson, the entire Mississippi River was now under Union control.
Through it all, when you look at the history of the Civil War, what was taking place between Memphis and New Orleans was seminal. And the genius of Lincoln as commander-in-chief and his Grant as a general is that they understood that you could win battles in Virginia and North Carolina till you're blue in the face, but whoever really controlled the Mississippi River in the end was going to be the victor.
Now that the Mississippi River was in the firm grasp of Union forces, Louisiana was virtually lost to the Confederacy. But as late as 1864, the rebels still controlled one of the last and now most vital waterways of the South, the Red River.
The Red River Campaign was an attempt by the Union Army and Navy to take Shreveport and then to go into Texas in an effort to bring both Louisiana and Texas into the Union. They easily took Alexandria. They easily took Natchitoches. But they did not take Shreveport. They were stopped by Confederate forces under Richard Taylor. He crushed the Union advance at Mansfield.
But Mansfield proved to be an empty victory for the Confederates. Elsewhere in the South, the war was already lost.
0 hour in Louisiana, the greatest field exercise in American military history.
Long after the Civil War, Louisiana would retain a significant place in the annals of U.S. military history. Beginning in the fall of 1940, this state set the stage for American involvement in World War II by hosting the largest war games our armed forces had ever undertaken. More than 1 million servicemen would receive training at Fort Polk and near the town of DeRidder in western Louisiana.
Louisiana has always had a martial spirit, and we got into the 20th century, it didn't lose that spirit. And you see Generals Patton and Eisenhower using Louisiana as a maneuver ground, a staging ground for training of troops for holding mock battles. One would be hard-pressed to pick another state that contributed to World War II as mightily as Louisiana did.
In all, some 274,000 people from Louisiana put on an American uniform during the war, a greater portion of the population than any other state. There were heroes like General Claire Lee Chennault, a former school teacher from Tensas Parish who formed the American Volunteer Group, known by the Chinese as the Flying Tigers. But many other heroes served their country here at home.
You also had Andrew Jackson Higgins, a great industrialist, starting to build what Hitler called Noah's Navy, meaning the great armada that would end up playing such an important role in D-Day. Higgins boats, or LDCs, were being built and tested here in the swamps of Louisiana.
Every American soldier who went ashore in an invasion in World War II did so in a boat built in New Orleans at Higgins Industries. If Andy Higgins had not designed and then built those landing craft, we never could have gone in over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different.
In the years since World War II, Louisianans have proudly carried the flag around the world, serving America in a wide variety of missions.
When the 256 Brigade deployed in 2004 and 2005, they did what was called full spectrum ops. And what that basically means is that unit comes in and is the battle space owner. Everything that occurs in there, from establishing government to providing security to feeding the population and supporting the local government of that country, falls within that realm of that spectrum. We rolled several million miles all over Iraq.
The U.S. military and Louisiana National Guard maintain a strong presence in all corners of the state, from Barksdale Air Force Base in the north to Fort Polk in the west to the Naval Air Station at Belle Chase in the south. And whether in war, in peacetime, or during a crisis, Louisianans have always stepped forward to secure the defense of our country and well-being of our people.
Until we say that the common man can fall only so low.
Here at home, and in the eyes of the rest of the nation, Louisiana has long been known for its colorful politics. When Louisiana first became an American state, power, both political and economic, was concentrated in the hands of wealthy plantation owners and the commercial class of New Orleans. Men who had a deep investment in the American institution of slavery. The question of slavery deeply divided the nation. Less than 50 years after Louisiana became one of the United States, she tore herself from the Union.
Louisiana, among all of the southern states, had the least reason to secede. We controlled the lower end of the Mississippi River. We had the largest city in the South in New Orleans. Our banking ties were with Chicago and with New England. Our trading partners were with the upper Midwest, we had everything going for us economically. They couldn't get away from slavery. They just couldn't get away from it. Let's face it, it is the driving force for secession.
Politically, Louisiana changed dramatically following the Civil War. Overnight, half the population went from being human chattel to being voting citizens.
They got the right to run for and to hold public office. And for a brief period of time, you did have blacks in the state legislature. You had one black who served in Congress. There were blacks on school boards and police steers and so forth.
The new political order in Louisiana did not sit well with those who formerly controlled the state. Louisiana descended into anarchy and violence, even as some labored to reconstruct a new Louisiana.
Reconstruction, some have described as a fool's errand, that the ideal is lost out, at least for the moment. The dream that they had for a non-racist society existed probably maybe 4 or 5 years at most.
It opened the door to hardliners who said under no circumstances will we accept any government as legitimate that's based upon black votes. And so a lot of these electoral battles were settled not by ballots, but by bullets.
The right to vote was effectively stripped from blacks and many poor whites. So-called Jim Crow laws were established, separating blacks from whites and reducing them to the status of second-class citizens. But these laws did not go unchallenged. Homer Plessy, an African-American from New Orleans, sought to overturn such legislation in the nation's highest courts. He initiated his suit by attempting to ride in a train car reserved for white passengers.
The newspapers were there. There was a detective there to conveniently arrest him because they wanted to get this to court, where they were certain that the United States Supreme Court, if it had to go that far, would rule that you could not legally separate passengers in public places on the basis of race or color. Well, to their surprise, they lost at every level. At the local level, at the state Supreme Court level, and at the national level. Segregation already existed, but now it became legal.
While black Louisianans struggled under the weight of Jim Crow laws, other Louisianans eventually gained new political rights. By 1920, women had won the right to vote. Within a few years, a new, polarizing political figure would take the stage in Louisiana, Huey Long.
Huey Long was a formidable leader and extraordinarily brilliant, extraordinarily forceful, a great orator.
Huey Long became the mouthpiece for a lot of people around the state, poor people, people who had felt disenfranchised, either politically or economically. He recognized their frustration, their fear, their anger, their estrangement from society, and their desire to play a greater role in Louisiana government, to speak for themselves, and he gave voice to them.
Huey Long ushered in the greatest political changes the state had seen since Reconstruction. Controversy followed close at his heels.
I grew up in a very poor family. When I was in grammar school, my father told us we couldn't go to school the next year because he couldn't afford the school books. That was a year that Huey Long put in free school books in the public education system. And consequently, I give Huey Long a great deal of credit for whatever I became in life because of the opportunities that he gave to me.
It's a mixed legacy. On one hand, you can say he pulled Louisiana out of the mud, and they built, roads and bridges. On the other hand, there was a lot of graft, a lot of corruption. He was a dictator, an American dictator. The first time in the history of the American Republic that something like this happened. He was a threat to democracy at the same time that he was bringing Louisiana into the 20th century.
Huey Long's influence on the state did not end with his assassination in 1935. Building upon the policies established by his brother Huey, Earl Long became governor in 1939. Under his leadership, the Long political machine would dominate Louisiana politics for many years to come. He was especially loved by the state's legions of poor people.
I think that Earl opened the process of government and the participation in politics to a great many people.
Earl Long is remembered by many for being just plain crazy. But many others remember him for the political advances he brought to black Louisianans.
Send old sapsucker a telegram. Wire him, call him. Tell him the woods are on fire.
When people think of Earl Long, they always say the crazy governor because of his spectacular meltdown on the floor of the legislature in 1959, bellowing profanities. He was really giving a civil rights speech at the time because he had registered 100,000 black people. He was extending that populist political machine that Huey Long had, pioneered, and he was adding black people to it, and he was running up against a legislature that was hostile to the idea of black voters.
He did a crazy thing, according to the white people at that time, standing up for black folk. He knew full well what he was doing. He knew the value of the black vote.
Racial matters would come to dominate Louisiana politics in the years following Earl Long's time as governor. For generations, black Louisianans had been subjected to separate and unequal treatment under the law. By the 1960s, the situation had grown intolerable to many black leaders. But change did not simply come from the top down. Instead, it sometimes arose from unlikely sources, including a group of young schoolgirls in New Orleans. One of them was the unforgettable Ruby Bridges.
They would do this chant, and it would go 2, 4, 6, 8. We don't want to integrate.
Meanwhile, in Baton Rouge, legislators were passing laws to circumvent integration.
We thought we were protecting the public school system in the state, and we thought it was being destroyed by that little school integration lawsuit down in New Orleans. We overreacted, and we overreacted out of fear. And we were all segregationists, don't let anybody tease you.
What happened that day is that we acquired the right to go into any school of our choice. That's what that was about.
From brave rulings by federal judges like John Minor Wisdom and J. Skelly Wright to the 1953 Baton Rouge bus boycott, Louisianans exercised vital leadership in guiding the country out of the dark days of segregation. But even as the years passed and Louisiana's laws changed to recognize the equality of black citizens, old attitudes remained the same among some. The 1991 gubernatorial runoff election between former Governor Edwin Edwards and former KKK leader David Duke presented Louisiana voters with a curious choice.
It was the worst scenario that anybody could have imagined for Louisiana voters, to have to choose between a former leader of the Ku Klux Klan and Edwin Edwards, who many people thought was far less than honest and who had disgraced the state in his own way. And so you saw people driving around in cars with bumper stickers that said, "Vote for the crook, it's important." It was that kind of choice for a lot of people.
No newcomer to Louisiana politics, Edwards had served 3 times as governor and led the state throughout much of the 1970s and 80s, long before David Duke arrived on the scene. To some, he was the last governor in the tradition of Huey and Earl Long.
I'm not looking for equal rights. I have superior rights.
I think his main contribution was A, to give us a new constitution, one that was workable, and B, to usher us into the post-civil rights era of reaching out to black voters and black politicians, incorporating them into the political order.
Edwards reveled in his image as a rogue, as someone who always stayed one step in front of the law. But eventually it caught up with him, and it's ironic that what got him was activity that he did as a private citizen. That it was not his actions as governor that sent him to prison, but it was actions after he had served his 4th term that resulted in an 8-year prison term.
Political power in Louisiana did not just reside in the governor's mansion. Throughout much of the 20th century, the nation looked to this state for leadership in Washington, D.C. Senior Democrats like Allen Ellender of Houma and New Orleanian Hale Boggs exercised formidable influence in Congress. Huey Long's son, Russell, was a powerful leader in the Senate, where he served for nearly 4 decades in the tradition of Southern Democrats who achieved power through seniority. At the turn of the century, Louisiana witnessed significant shifts in the political landscape. The Democrats, who had controlled state government since the Civil War, were unseated by a remarkable rise in power of the Republican Party. From 1980 to 1984, David Treen served as the state's first Republican governor since Reconstruction. In the years to come, Republicans would dominate the legislature and statewide elected offices.
I think part of it is a pendulum shift. It's happening not only in Louisiana, but across the South. I think the South is becoming more red in the national elections, more conservative in the state elections.
In 2003, the state saw the election of its first woman governor, Kathleen Blanco. 4 years later, Bobby Jindal became the first U.S. governor of Indian descent to be elected to that office. When the framers of Louisiana's first Constitution met at Tremolet's Coffee House, they could not have imagined the weighty drama and sheer spectacle of Louisiana's political theater.
For you can be a millionaire.
Elsewhere on the stage, the pageant of Louisiana history plays out against a colorful backdrop of arts and culture. The state's music, its literature, its sports, its world-renowned cuisine, all are a product of the rich diversity of peoples who call this place home.
All those cultures in collision produce something that's more than the sum of the parts by far. And it sets Louisiana apart from the rest of the United States.
European explorers encountered a complex society of native tribes. Later, the French established trading posts in places like Natchitoches, the oldest European settlement in the Louisiana Territory. French and Spanish colonists joined with Indians, as well as their African slaves and free people of color. The blending of these peoples and their distinctive traditions came to be known as Creole. Living alongside the Creoles were the Acadians, or Cajuns, as they are most often called today. Exiled from Nova Scotia in the 18th century, these French Catholic settlers now made their home here. Together with the Creoles, they gave South Louisiana a character that differed sharply from North Louisiana. Anglo-American farmers, most of them Protestant, poured into the northern part of the state, bringing with them a culture that more closely resembled the rest of the American South. At the same time, 19th century New Orleans became even more culturally eclectic. The busy port attracted ships from all over the world, and thousands of immigrants crossed the city's docks to become Americans. For all their differences, one thing brought these diverse people together: music. Music is everywhere in Louisiana, from funeral processions to Mardi Gras parades. The Creole culture of New Orleans was birthed from the merger of various European and African populations. In time, the blending of European and African influences would find its most exuberant expression in the music of jazz.
Jazz is a uniquely American music that had its origins in New Orleans during the late 1890s and early 1900s. To the African American originators of the music, jazz represented freedom of expression. Louis Armstrong helped to really change the face of American, not only jazz, but popular music. One of the most important influences in early New Orleans jazz is the blues. The blues developed in the Mississippi Delta region in the 1880s as the leisure music of black people. It combines elements of work songs and spirituals and dance music.
Elsewhere in the state, other forms of music would soon give voice to the wide variety of people and heritages that make up Louisiana.
When skies are gray. Goodbye, Joe. Me gotta go. Me oh my oh. Me gotta go. Pull the P road down the bayou. Found my thrill. Oh, Blueberry Hill.
Musical expression and religious experience are closely connected in Louisiana history.
The gospel tradition exists in that intimate setting of the church, and it's the fabric of the community. You've got people like the Zion Travelers in Baton Rouge are on the radio for, oh God, almost a half a century. But most of the groups just don't ever get heard because they're in the churches and they stay there. And I think a lot of gospels like that. But then you have bust-out people. Obviously, you have somebody like Jimmy Swaggart, who is kin to Jerry Lee Lewis and Mickey Gilley, and he's taking that to the big televised arena. Mickey Gilley takes it to a nightclub in Houston, famously in country and western and more secular. Of course, Jerry Lee Lewis goes to Memphis, and life has never been quite the same since old Jerry Lee.
For goodness gracious, great balls of fire.
Rural South Louisiana is home to a large population of Cajuns. Together with the black Creoles of the region, they have produced unique forms of music in their native French language.
The two classics that come to my mind are two people who played together. His name was Dennis McGee and Amadou Ardouin. They have a Cajun and you have a Creole. From those two people, now you have about 80% of the Acadian music repertoire, and also what we call Zydeco.
The close cultural connection between Cajuns and Creoles is embodied in their music, and that music binds communities together.
Not only the musicians who play, but it's the people there who dance to the music, people who make the food, it's people who listen. It's a whole congregation.
Louisiana's eclectic music and traditions overflow from celebrations throughout the state, like the annual Jazz and Heritage Festival in New Orleans. But music was not the only form of expression that Louisiana artists found to convey their experience of this most unique place and its people. Even for people who have never been here, Louisiana lives vividly in the imagination of America, thanks to works of literature like the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, A Streetcar Named Desire, and A Confederacy of Dunces. Few other places have been home to so many important American authors.
It's the most intriguing place I've ever been. And I think for the artist, a locale like Louisiana is an enormous gift because the history of the state is always visible. You can still touch the past with the end of your hand.
One thing about a Louisiana locale is that it always contains some element of surprise. You can't take anything for granted in Louisiana, and I think writers love that. People here really love language. They love to talk. They love stories.
Louisiana is also home to a spectacular tradition of visual arts as well.
Louisiana has one of the most unique, broad and deep artistic traditions of any of the 50 states. If we look at our architecture, we look at our music, we look at our culinary arts, it's not surprising that the visual arts have a very, very broad and deep cultural outfall from the history of the unique history of the state.
But perhaps nothing is more iconic of Louisiana's rich mix of ingredients than our cuisine.
7 or 8 different nations who all were great cooks, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Africans, even the Native Americans and the English. You put 7 or 8 cultures who love cooking, love entertaining, their only social event is around a table, and you give them an outdoor pantry like the swamplands of Louisiana, food is an explosion.
Another thing that unites Louisianans across the centuries is our long-standing love of play.
Sports in general are a wonderful common denominator. It doesn't matter if you're an LSU fan, a Tulane fan, a Louisiana Tech, Grambling, Southern. Sports brings so many things together in Louisiana that it's just unbelievable.
Louisianans' famous love of sport extends beyond the stadium and into fields and forests throughout the state.
Louisiana is truly a sportsman's paradise. You've got the finest fishing in all the world, and trust me, I've traveled the world hunting and fishing, and there are more opportunities in Louisiana than I've ever seen in all the places I've ever been.
But along with their passion for play, Louisianans also work hard. Our labors have made this state a place of lively commerce and industry. The fertile Mississippi Delta makes Louisiana one of the world's great agricultural gardens. From timber to cattle, from soybeans to yams, a tremendous harvest springs from the soil of Louisiana farms each year. On the big plantations of the 19th century, agriculture came to resemble the industrial factories of the northern United States, with hundreds of laborers working to power the two great engines of the Louisiana economy, cotton and sugar. By the mid-1800s, New Orleans had become one of the largest ports in the world in terms of cargo volume. The steamboat helped make this possible, but New Orleans was not the only place to prosper from the big paddle wheelers. In northwestern Louisiana, Captain Henry Miller Shreve worked with specially outfitted steamboats to clear the massive logjam that choked the Red River above Alexandria.
Henry Shreve is perhaps unique in American history. He was brilliant, he was fearless, he was audacious. He knew that he could do things he didn't believe that anybody else could. He intended to show everybody what he could do.
Once Shreve opened the river, allowing navigation to the Mississippi, commerce boomed in North Louisiana and Texas, making Shreve's port the most important city in the region. In the early 19th century, Louisiana was a place of remarkable prosperity. The city of New Orleans was the capital of the South, rivaling the great metropolises of the Northeast, both in wealth and in culture. But all that would change with the coming of the Civil War.
Louisiana in particular sustained heavy losses, both in agricultural machinery and in livestock. But the one thing that really knocked them for a loop was the fact that all of a sudden most of their capital, which was in slaves, had been dissolved. They'd been turned into citizens. And so that the financial basis of an entire region had basically collapsed into a puddle.
By the late 1870s and 1880s, the state's economy began to show signs of revival. Backed by wealthy industrialists in the Northeast, railroads were again built throughout the state, transforming isolated rural regions. Just as towns had once sprung up along Louisiana's rivers the century before, depot towns like Ruston, Bunkie, and DeQuincy became vital stops along the state's growing railway lines. As poor as the people of Louisiana were, the land was astonishingly rich in natural resources. This attracted out-of-state industries looking for cheap raw materials. Lumber companies removed vast tracts of old-growth cypress and pine from the state, stripping the land bare. Conservationists like Caroline Dorman responded by trying to preserve the state's natural resources. In the 1930s, she led efforts to establish KISATCHIE, the only national forest in Louisiana, comprising some 604,000 acres over 7 parishes. It was the discovery of one particular natural resource that would prompt an entirely new industry to surge to the forefront of Louisiana's economy. In 1901, just outside the town of Jennings, Louisiana's first commercial oil well tapped into the state's rich petroleum reserves. Soon, derricks sprouted around the state, especially in the Caddo Lake area near Shreveport. The industry brought tremendous wealth to some Louisianans, and especially to growing American corporations like Standard Oil of New Jersey. Over the next 100 years, oil would transform Louisiana's economy, culture, and ecology more completely than any other discovery.
I think when you take a look at Louisiana, and certainly the last 100 years, you can't tell the story of Louisiana without including the oil and gas industry. And when I take a look at energy exploration, production, refining, processing, and transportation, I would say that there's no more important piece of real estate in all of America than Louisiana.
Thanks to advances in technologies, the Haynesville shale discovery in North Louisiana promises to be among the richest deposits of natural gas in America. It is now possible to extract gas from the shale because of the new high-pressure process of hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking.
We've got some new gas supplies that we didn't have before, and that's good, but the negative side of that is that this fracking does cause problems with the groundwater.
I think when you take a look at the Haynesville, it has been a dramatic opportunity for Louisiana. It has made natural gas a commodity more available and less expensive to Americans. It has helped fund local education, local governments in a very, very big way.
The nation's reliance on our unique geography has never been greater. Fully 1/3 of America's energy flows from or through Louisiana.
We need the jobs for economic growth. At the same time, we don't need those jobs impacting human health and the environment. So it's not one or the other. The issue is it has to be safe and healthy jobs for the workers and for the people living in the area around it and for the environment.
We need to be a generation that is about the balance of the 3 E's, energy, environment, and economy. And if in the 40s and the 50s, our public policy was such that we were not as concerned about the environment, we have a chance to do better. And we need to have a balance between those three.
Louisianans realize that the state's economic success cannot depend on any one industry. With a strong emphasis on better education, we look to new technologies and new businesses for our future. Biomedical industries are a rapidly growing field, with advanced research centers in Shreveport, New Orleans, and Baton Rouge.
And what we do here is we use all the tools. We use basic science, clinical science, population science, and we try to understand the mechanisms of disease, and then we try to develop approaches to remediating disease. And then we're just getting into this. We try to translate what we know into the real world.
At least 4 active businesses that have come through Pennington that are generating their own sources of income. And should we be lucky enough, some of these businesses will grow to be very large and successful. So this has a multiplier effect. The overall economic impact of a center like Pennington is so important that you think of Silicon Valley or the biotech corridors around Harvard and MIT. That's what we're going to be.
Another novel venture is the film industry. Louisiana is now the 3rd leading state for movie production, behind only New York and California.
Since 2002, Louisiana led the nation in motion picture incentives. We looked at what was happening around the world, adopted a model that worked for Louisiana, have steadily and closely built up the infrastructure, the crew base.
If you're just looking from an economic standpoint, whereas in 2002, maybe the total value of all the productions that came to the state was under $10 million. In 2010, if you add them all up, it was $1.4 billion. The tax incentives are definitely a game changer.
Along with recruiting productions to the state, Louisiana's film industry is working to cultivate homegrown cinematic artists and their businesses.
Growing up in Louisiana, you have a different slant on life if you've gone to Mardi Gras at any point in your life, but especially as a little kid. You're never the same, and you go through life with a different point of view than most people you'll encounter. That life is to be embraced and celebrated, and the absurd should be encouraged from time to time, and that day-to-day life can suddenly become a technicolor dream. And I think if I hadn't grown up with that in my life, I don't think I would have been the storyteller that I am today.
Louisiana's prosperity has often been difficult to achieve and harder to maintain. It seems that for all the cultural richness of this place and its natural bounty, Louisiana is also regularly visited by disaster, both natural and man-made. From the earliest days of colonization, settlers in Louisiana had to contend with fires, floods, hurricanes, disease, and disasters of all kinds. For a long time, nothing was more dreaded here than the scourge of yellow fever. Carried by mosquitoes, yellow fever descended like a plague on the state annually, with some years much worse than others. The disease claimed thousands upon thousands of lives.
In August of 1853, 900 people died in New Orleans in less than 4 weeks. Here is a period when the city has about 50,000 people. That's a huge number of mortalities.
Like yellow fever, floods were an annual ritual of disaster faced by Louisiana's early settlers. But no flood, before it or since, has matched the Great Flood of 1927 for its widespread destruction. It left nearly 1 million Americans homeless, with approximately 200,000 of them in Louisiana alone. In some places, the Mississippi River had grown to more than 100 miles wide. Hardest hit was the French-speaking region of Acadiana, where a vast pool of water stretched from Baton Rouge to Opelousas. When the levee broke at Moraville, southeast of Alexandria, a wall of water 16 feet high rolled over the land at 35 miles per hour, plowing through everything in its path.
Most clear item in my mind was the roar of the water. When my mother and dad got all the children up to start dressing, with the roar of the water coming on, they pretty well knew we would be evacuating.
The Coast Guard was evacuating people with a boat named Shark River. And we flagged it down and it stopped. And as we went down the bayou, there were a lot of people on the levees waving and trying to get the boat to stop. But of course it was at capacity, over capacity really, and they couldn't stop.
Following the flood of 1927, the state undertook a massive construction of levees and river control measures. But the Mississippi River is just one source of flooding. Louisiana's intricate system of levees also protects the state in those times when hurricanes strike. These storms can push a wall of water up through the coastal wetlands and into populated areas. Beginning in 2005, Hurricanes Rita, Gustav, and Ike came in rapid succession, making recovery difficult for many years to come. These storms wrought untold misery for their victims. However, seared into the American consciousness are images of the unmatched devastation that accompanied Hurricane Katrina.
As a result of Katrina and the breaking of the levees, I lost my home and everything I owned. What the water didn't destroy, the mildew and mold finished.
Hurricane Katrina had dropped to a Category 3 when it came ashore. But New Orleans flood control systems failed, leading many to consider the deluge that followed to be a man-made disaster. Critics point not only to the failure of the levees, but of government at every level.
We had come to believe in the United States that we can do anything, put a man on the moon, and suddenly we seemed unable to just airlift people off of buildings or provide water or food for people at the Superdome and Convention Center.
Days after the storm made landfall, fully 80% of the city was underwater. 180,000 homes and other structures were damaged or destroyed. Most distressing of all, some 1,600 people lost their lives. Louisiana received aid from around the nation, but in the end, it was neighbors helping neighbors here at home that really saved the state. Throughout Louisiana, people opened their homes, churches, and communities to those fleeing the city. Storm-tossed victims found welcoming shelter in Shreveport, Monroe, Alexandria, Lafayette, and many other communities. It was the kindness of strangers that preserved the people of New Orleans and allowed them to return home.
I've lost a lot resulting from the devastation, and life as I knew it ended. With every end comes a new beginning.
No waterline on music, no waterline on the soul. And it's a simple thing, but it's a profound thing.
While hurricanes strike quickly and wreak havoc in a very short time, other disasters faced by Louisiana are slow to evolve, but cause even more lasting damage. The wetlands of Louisiana comprise some 3 million acres, or about 4,700 square miles. Almost 40% of all the wetlands of the lower 48 states are concentrated in southern Louisiana. But for decades, the state has been shrinking. The Gulf of Mexico has eaten away Louisiana at a rate of about 16.5 square miles each year. Scientists predict that if we do not act to restore the vanishing wetlands, the costs could be unimaginable.
If not, there's going to be a mass exodus from this area. And I'm not only talking about moving out of homes and moving communities. I'm talking about infrastructure. Everything is going to have to be moved. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars.
Historically, Louisiana's wetlands have served as a buffer against hurricane damage.
If you remove all of that habitat and you just have unrestricted, unimpeded wall of water moving in, it's going to crash and move into communities at its initial level. Hurricane Katrina pushed in a 29-foot storm surge.
Recent storms, like Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, have shown just what the loss of our wetlands really means. There are many forces at work that cause coastal erosion. The land of the Delta is sinking naturally, and sea levels are rising due to climate change. The Mississippi River no longer deposits sediment to build up new land. Commercial interests have carved up the marshes with canals. A major reason for Louisiana's gradual disappearance is human interference with the elemental force that created this place, the Mississippi River.
Now, to restore it, we have to restore the land that was here in places where it was.
What's at stake is nothing less than the very existence of coastal Louisiana as a place and as a people.
If that habitat goes away, if the wetlands go away, we go away. And that's the greatest tragedy of all.
In April 2010, our wetlands faced a particularly severe threat. The Deepwater Horizon oil platform exploded off our shores. 11 workers died, and oil poured into the Gulf of Mexico for 3 months straight.
It took 9 days for the crude to reach the coastal areas of Louisiana, and the crude continued to flow till the middle of July. And so the crude oil was dispersed into the Gulf and all along the coastal areas of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Panhandle of Florida.
Suffice it to say, it was a horrendous incident. Any major oil spill is horrendous. It's mostly an acute event. Damage occurs during the event. Long-term damage, difficult to predict. We won't know for certain until all the studies have been done. This may take 5 to 10 years.
But the Louisiana wetlands and its people have staged a remarkable comeback since the oil spill.
It is truly amazing how quickly our environment is recovering.
This is characteristic of Louisiana throughout its history. Through plagues, storms, and civil war, Louisianans have survived and even flourished. Over the course of 2 centuries, we have contributed to our country a strong defense, colorful politics, dynamic arts and culture, vital commerce and industry, and an inspiring tradition of resilience and recovery. In 1812, Louisiana became one of the United States, and America would add an 18th star to her flag. Proudly, for 200 years, we have been Americans, but unlike any others.
For more information, go online to lpb.org and LouisianaBicentennial2012.com. Major funding for Louisiana, 200 Years of Statehood, is provided by the Louisiana Bicentennial Commission and the Louisiana Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, and by Entergy Louisiana, dedicated to the communities we serve for over 100 years. Entergy, the power of people. The Reilly Family Foundation, supporting the arts, cultural, and health-based initiatives throughout Louisiana since 2002. Your local Louisiana propane dealer, fuel for residential, agricultural, industrial, and commercial uses. Additional funding by ExxonMobil Baton Rouge. And the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting. For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.